Today, we are diving into one of the most chaotic, world-shattering events in all of human history, the French Revolution. This was a story that started with a promise of liberty for all, but spiraled into a nightmare of terror that would change Europe forever. The year is 1789, and in France, a fuse is about to be lit. A fuse that's going to detonate a social order that had stood more or less for 1,000 years. And at the very heart of that old world was the absolute monarchy. This whole system built on the divine right of kings and inherited power. It was all about to come crashing down. But this was not a clean break. In the name of that revolution, an estimated 40,000 people would be executed, many of them right out in public for everyone to see. So, how on earth did a movement for freedom and equality turn into one of history's most infamous bloodbaths? I'm about to show you. To really get what happened, you have to understand the pressure cooker that was 18th century France. The whole kingdom was ready to explode. French society was basically split into three groups. They called them estates. You had the first estate, that's the clergy. The second estate, the nobility. Together, these guys were just 2% of the population, but they had most of the wealth and paid almost no taxes. So who was it that was paying for everything? It was the third estate. And who is that? Literally everyone else, 98% of the people, and they were stuck with the entire tax bill. It's a system practically designed to make people angry. And on top of that deep inequality, the government was completely broke. Why? Well, decades of war. Plus, they just bankrolled the American Revolution. So the treasury was empty. And while the country was drowning in debt, you have King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette living this life of insane luxury at Versailles. Meanwhile, the actual people of France, they were literally starving in the streets. And let's not gloss over that last point. At its core, this revolution wasn't just about lofty ideas of liberty. It was about bread. People were hungry. They were desperate. And they were furious. And that is an explosive combination. So, how does all that simmering anger and desperation finally boil over into a full-blown uprising? Well, the people, now armed with these new radical ideas from the Enlightenment, decided they'd finally had enough. And when it kicked off, it moved incredibly fast. In May of 1789, the king calls this meeting to try and fix the money problems. By June, the Third Estate declares themselves the real government. By July of that year, Paris is in open revolt, storming the Bastille prison. By August, they've written a document that basically flips the entire old world on its head. One of the most amazing moments was the tennis court oath. The king locked the commoners out of their meeting hall. So what did the commoners do? They walk over to a nearby tennis court and swear an oath right there. They declare that they are the National Assembly, the true voice of the people, and they weren't leaving until they had written a constitution. It was a staggering act of defiance. But here's where the story takes a really dark turn. All that initial hope and idealism, this dream of a new fair France, it soured quickly into paranoia, fear, and extreme violence. The revolutionaries became terrified of enemies, both inside France and out. When the king and queen tried to flee the country in 91, it confirmed everyone's worst fears. Then Austria and Prussia threatened to invade. So France declares a preemptive war. But when the enemy commander says he'll burn Paris to the ground to restore the king, that's it. The paranoia goes into overdrive. And that paranoia unleashed what we now call the Reign of Terror. Between 1793 and 94, this radical group called the Jacobin took over. They set up the Committee of Public Safety and the guillotine. That became the symbol of the new republic. In that period alone, over 16,000 people were officially executed by the supposedly humane new machine. And here's something that might surprise you. We tend to think of the terror as just the poor getting revenge on the rich. But look at the numbers. Sure, the clergy and nobility were targeted. They made up about 15% of the victims. But the huge majority, 85%, were ordinary people, peasants, commoners, just average folks accused of being enemies of the revolution. The man right at the center of all this was Maximilien Robespierre. He was this quiet, intense attorney, known as the Incorruptible because of his rigid principles. He genuinely believed that terror was necessary to protect the revolution, that it was a tool to build a new republic of virtue. This quote from another revolutionary leader, Mirabeau, just nails what made Robespierre so terrifying. He wasn't just some power-hungry tyrant. He was a true believer. And that absolute conviction, that certainty that he was right, gave him the justification to eliminate anyone who stood in his path. But terror has a way of consuming itself. Eventually, the revolutionaries turned on Robespierre. He ended up at the guillotine too. And while his death ended the terror, it left a huge power vacuum right in the middle of France. By this point, France was exhausted. Exhausted by years of chaos, war, and constant bloodshed. The government was weak. It was unstable. The country was desperate for anyone who could promise to restore order. And there was a leader waiting in the wings, a brilliant, unbelievably ambitious, and totally ruthless young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise was meteoric. First, he's a young military hero, defending the new republic from its enemies. Then, in 1799, he uses that fame and his army to overthrow the government in a coup. And a few years after that, the guy who was supposed to be the great savior of the republic, he literally places a crown on his own head and becomes emperor. And the irony here is incredible. Maximilien Robespierre himself had once warned against trying to spread revolution through war. He famously said, "No one loves armed missionaries." But that is exactly what Napoleon would do, marching his armies all across Europe, trying to export the revolution by force. And that had this huge unintended consequence. As Napoleon's armies rolled across the continent, he sparked something new. People in Spain, Germany, and Russia, they started seeing themselves not just as subjects of some king, but as part of a nation, united in resistance to this foreign invader. Napoleon accidentally helped create modern European nationalism. In the end, the French Revolution is a story packed with contradictions. It starts by killing a king to get liberty, but it ends by crowning an emperor to get order. It championed the rights of man, but it led to mass executions, which really leaves us with this one big question. What is the true price of revolutionary change? I hope this video brought you some value today. If it did, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep explorations into history. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.